Greetings and welcome to Word Magazine. This is Jeff Riddle. I'm the pastor of Christ Reformed Baptist Church in Louisa, Virginia. And in this episode of Word Magazine, I'm going to be responding to a question that a listener to the podcast and a longtime friend sent to me by email a couple of weeks ago. He posed this question. Again, he holds to our position, but I'm guessing it's a challenge or a question that he's received from people who are skeptical or even outright hostile to the position. And when he sent me the question, I sent an email response and I offered 5 quick responses. And then after I sent that, I thought, that might make a good podcast because he's heard this question. Probably other people have too. And I got his permission to share his question. And so that's going to be the subject for the podcast today. So let me go ahead and pull up a little PowerPoint that I created, hopefully to help us work through the question and 5 of the responses that I offered to it. So the question that was posed was this. This is what he wrote. He said, "On what basis can you say authoritatively that the TR, the Textus Receptus, the received text, the Protestant text, is the, capital THE, is the confessional text when the confession nowhere mentions either the Masoretic text or the Textus Receptus?" By the confession here, this friend is a fellow Reformed Baptist, but the question could be posed related to the Westminster Confession of Faith or related to the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith. On what basis can we authoritatively say that the received text, and this, although TR usually refers to the New Testament, this could refer to the traditional Old Testament text, the traditional New Testament text. How can we say it is the definitive confessional text when the confession nowhere explicitly mentions the Masoretic text or the Greek Textus Receptus? So again, it's a great question. Maybe some of you have heard that question. So I responded back to my friend and I said, here are some reasons to think that the traditional Protestant text, by that we mean the Masoretic Hebrew Old Testament and the Greek Textus Receptus New Testament, is the confessional standard. 5 reasons why it's not irrational, it's not some sort of special consideration, but it should be a normative um, uh, assumption when we think about the confession and what text were the framers thinking about? What text did they use? So here are the 5 reasons. First of all, we believe that the traditional Protestant text is the confessional text because it was this text that was clearly used for the proof texts within the Westminster Confession of Faith and the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith. And just to demonstrate this, we could look at Confession of Faith, chapter 2, which is on the doctrine of God and on the Trinity, and paragraph 3. And what are the proof texts that are cited? Well, 1 John 5:7, the 3 heavenly witnesses, the passage that is removed from the text of many modern printings of the Greek New Testament, scholarly editions of the Greek New Testament, even removed from translations of the Greek or of the Greek New Testament into various languages. The ESV removes it, doesn't even have a footnote for it. Also, John 1:18, very key passage about the eternal generation of the Son. And it reads only begotten Son. And that's exactly the wording of the confession. Another example would be in chapter 29 and paragraph 2 in the Second London Baptist Confession of 1689, when it tries to give proof text for a biblical justification for baptism. What does it list? Mark 16:16, which is part of the traditional or long ending of Mark. And it also lists Acts 8:37, a verse that is removed in many modern critical texts of the Greek New Testament and modern translations. In addition to that, I would just point out on this first point that the proof texts that are there were not haphazardly chosen, but they were intentionally chosen. So in the preface to the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith, the framers said, "We have also taken care to affix texts at the bottom for the confirmation of each article in our confession, in which work we have studiously endeavored to select such as are most clear and pertinent for the proof of what is asserted by us." So, what was their text? What was the text, capital THE, that was used by the framers of the confession? And what, therefore, is the confessional text? Well, it's the traditional Protestant text, the Masoretic text of the Hebrew Old Testament, and the Textus Receptus of the Greek New Testament. That includes 1 John 5:7. That includes Mark 16:16. That includes Acts 8:37. That includes at John 1:18, Son, only begotten Son, monogenes huios, rather than only God, as it is put in modern texts and modern translations. So that's number one. Number two, Confession 1:8 notes that the immediately inspired Hebrew text is the standard for the Old Testament. Now it says that the immediately inspired Hebrew text is the standard for the Old Testament, and the immediately inspired Greek text is the standard for the New Testament. And this is the famous chapter 1, paragraph 8 that we so often talk about and cite. The Old Testament in Hebrew, which was the native language of the people of God of old, and the New Testament in Greek, which at the time of the writing of it was most generally known to the nations, being immediately inspired by God and by his singular care and providence kept pure in all ages, are therefore authentic or authentical. So my point is that clearly the framers of the confession were asserting that the standard for the Old Testament was the traditional Hebrew text. This necessarily excludes texts and translations that attempt to correct the Hebrew because they believe it's corrupted. The framers did not believe that the Hebrew text had been corrupted. They believe it had been kept pure by God's singular care and providence. And therefore, they repudiated, rejected the idea of using ancient versions, translations like the Septuagint, the Latin Vulgate, the Syriac, etc., to correct the Hebrew. And this is precisely, however, what is done in modern critical text, and this is what it is done in modern translations. The English Standard Version, for example, attempts supposedly to correct the Hebrew Old Testament text hundreds of times by means of the Septuagint. And so, what is the confessional text used by the framers of the confession? It was the traditional Hebrew text. And they did not believe that that should be corrected. They didn't believe it was corrupted. And they certainly didn't believe it should be corrected by ancient versions. Third of these five reasons, the Protestant Orthodox men who framed the confession assumed the reliability and the usage of the traditional text. Here is respected historian Richard A. Muller's definition of the Greek New Testament Textus Receptus in his Dictionary of Latin and Greek Theological Terms. This is what he said. This is how you define the Textus Receptus, the received text, i.e., that is to say, the standard Greek text of the New Testament published by Erasmus in 1516, and virtually contemporaneously by Ximenes, the Complutensian polyglot, printed in 1514 but not circulated, i.e., published until 1522, and subsequently reissued with only slight emendation by Stephanus in 1550, Beza in 1565, and Elzevir, the Elzevirs, in 1633. Muller goes on to say the term Textus Receptus comes from Elsevier's preface, Textum ergo habes nunc ab omnibus receptum. Therefore, you have the text now received by all. The term, this is Muller speaking, was adopted as standard usage only after the period of orthodoxy. So people didn't use the term Textus Receptus till after the period of Protestant orthodoxy, although it does refer to the text supported by the Protestant scholastics as the authentic text quo ad verba, with respect to the words of the text. And so here is probably the best known and considered the most competent interpreter of the Protestant Orthodox. And he's telling us that the Protestant Orthodox, the men who were the framers of the Westminster Confession of Faith, the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith, that they held to the received text as the standard text for the Greek New Testament. This was the capital T-H-E confessional text. Fourth of these 5 points, the Protestant Orthodox divines typically referred to the vulgar copy or the common text as the standard. We see this in the writings of men like Owen and Turretin, etc. And here is just one example from the Prince of the Puritans, John Owen. This is from an essay found in his Works, volume 16, page 359. It's a quotation I've used a number of times. He says, "Let it be remembered that the vulgar copy we use was the public possession of many generations. That, upon the invention of printing, it was in actual authority throughout the world with them that used and understood that language. Let that," meaning that vulgar copy, which became the standard printed text, the Textus Receptus, "let that then pass for the standard, which is confessedly its right and due, and we shall, God assisting, quickly see how little reason there is to pretend such varieties of readings as we are now surprised withal." Owen was not a fan of piling up variant readings to undermine the common or received text. So the fourth argument is this was the view that we see expressed in the writings of the Protestant divines. This is sort of piggybacking on the assessment that was made by Muller in the third point. Fifth and final point that I shared with my friend. The traditional text, Hebrew Masoretic text of the Old Testament, Greek Textus Receptus of the New Testament, was the basis for all the Protestant era Bible translations in various vernacular languages. So you had the traditional text that was printed, and then the translations that were made foundationally in various languages, whether that was French or Dutch or Hungarian or Italian or English, going back to, for us, those of us who are English speakers, going back to Tyndale, and then all those early Protestant translations of the Bible, the Matthew's Bible, the Coverdale Bible, the Geneva Bible, the Bishop's Bible, the Authorized Version, King James Version. They were all based on the traditional Protestant text. This was the Bible they were reading. And so it is not some absurd assertion that we're making that the capital T-H-E text of the Protestant Orthodox, the framers of the confession, was the confessional text. I added a little afterward. This is directly from the email I sent back to my friend. I said, one might say, and they often do, our opponents or skeptics might say, and they often do, that if these men of the past, the framers of the confession, or Owen or Turretin, if they had the information that we have today, then they assert they would embrace the modern text. But this must remain a historical speculation. We don't know that for certain. They were men of a different era. They were pre-Enlightenment. And you might speculate that, but it's not provable. There is no doubt, however, historically, as to which text they received and used. Of course, they used the traditional Protestant text, the Hebrew Masoretic text for the Old Testament, the Greek Textus Receptus for the New Testament. So I hope that this little response has been helpful and will be encouraging, edifying, even enlightening for those who are listening. And I think if somebody challenges you and says, wait a second, how do you know they were using the confessional text? Well, we have very obvious reasons for making that assertion. And it's actually persons who are suggesting the use of the modern critical text that are representing a departure from the practices of the Protestant Orthodox. And so rarely do they ever feel compelled to provide any justification for that. We are not departing. We're arguing for retrieval of the traditional position over against those who have sometimes uncritically departed from the traditional Protestant position. Again, hope that this episode has been helpful. I'll look forward to speaking to you in the next episode of Word Magazine. Till then, take care and may the Lord richly bless you.